Good morning or good evening, everyone, whether joining from China, Asia, or North America, and especially to our distinguished speakers, Professor Deborah Davis and Suowei Xiao from the Beijing Normal University. Welcome to this Yale Center Beijing event. I am Carolee Rafferty, a Yale College alumna, as well as the Managing Director of the Yale Center Beijing. Before we begin, I'll give a really brief introduction about the center for those of you who are new to these types of events, and also introduce our wonderful speakers for today. Founded in 2014, the Yale Center Beijing is Yale University's only university-wide center outside of its US campus, and we host events such as these where we convene leaders from academia, business, government, the arts and sciences for dialogues on the most important and interesting issues on the world almost every other day since we were founded. So we have since hosted thousands of events. Today, I'm really delighted to be able to host this panel discussion on changing family dynamics in urban China as part of the Greenberg Distinguished Colloquium, where we're honored to have Professors Deborah Davis and Suowei Xiao, who are both sociologists studying contemporary Chinese urban family dynamics, to introduce their work and their research overall. Some already featured in Chinese Families Upside Down, Intergenerational Dynamics, and Neo-Familism in Early 21st Century, which is a volume edited by Professor Yunxiang Yan. I believe our participants have already received copies of the chapters, and I hope you've had a chance to review them or will be able to go back to them after this talk. Let me give a brief introduction to our distinguished guests. Deborah Davis is a professor emerita of sociology at Yale University, where she served as director of academic programs at the Yale Center for Study of Globalization, was chair of the Department of Sociology and co-chair of the Women Faculty Forum. Her primary teaching interests include inequality and stratification, contemporary Chinese society, and methods of fieldwork. She previously served 6 terms as a trustee of the Yale China Association, which was founded back in 1905, and chaired the advisory board of the University's Service Center Library at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Currently, she is on the editorial boards of the China Quarterly, the China Review, and the Chinese Sociological Review. And if it weren't for COVID, she would also be teaching at the Schwarzman College in Beijing, and really hope to see her back in our neck of the woods. Professor Suowei Xiao is Associate Professor of Sociology at Beijing Normal University. She earned her PhD in sociology at UC Berkeley and her BA in Chinese literature at Peking University. She is the author of Desire and Dignity, Class, Gender, and Intimacy in Transitional China, and a number of articles on gender, intergenerational relations, family change, and class formation. Now, today's event will proceed as follows. Deborah and Suowei will each give a presentation based on their research for about 20 minutes. And then the two of them will have a discussion among themselves about each of their work. And then we'll open up the floor for questions from our audience. And depending on the timing, I may post them or I may unmute each of you to post them. You're more than welcome to type your questions in the chat box throughout the talk, although we're already grateful that we've collected many questions before the event. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Deborah Davis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carol, for this opportunity. As you said, it's a disappointment not to be in Beijing. I left in January 10th, 2020, expecting to be back in March, and I'm still waiting. You've read the chapter, or at least you have the chapter. So what I thought I'd do first is I'm going to talk a little bit about the issues and themes that were in that chapter, and then I'm going to share some more academic material and to look at this question of where is China going? Our work is looking at the past, and we all are thinking about what comes next. So I'm going to start now very briefly saying something about this chapter, We Do, parental involvement in the marriages of urban sons and daughters. I have been working in Shanghai since 1981, and initially I focused on the elderly and on pensions, and I did that for 3 or 4 years in the early 80s. And as my main subjects were newly retired women, textile workers, but also other kinds of blue collar workers and a few professionals, I was learning a great deal about their family life. And so at the end of that decade, one of the things that struck me was how one generation had been lost. And I was very interested to find out how they were going to go forward in their lives. So I was already engaged with looking at how parents and adult children experience life, what they share. Then in the 90s, I did a lot of field work in China, mostly in Shanghai again, because the conditions were good and I had partners. And we became very interested in consumption and issues of occupational mobility and entrepreneurship. And again, this issue of family was there, if not the focus, because it was through family that people found their jobs. It was through family that people raised capital to start small firms. And then after 2000, I worked more and more at the macro level for large scale urban development, particularly of real estate and housing. But at the same time, I was able to do field work in Yunnan province in poverty communities. And again, information on families, how families decide to live together, how they pool resources, and in the issue of marriage, how spouses find each other. Are they relying on their parents? Do they make their own decision? Do they need parental approval? And then as these young adults become parents and their lives become more complicated, what kind of family ties develop? So this is the long sweep of these decades of work. This particular essay, if you read it, is based on the fieldwork I did in Shanghai in between 2015 and 2018. And there are several articles, and you'll see reference to them if you want to think about them. What I'm now going to do is briefly hit some of the highlights and give you some illustrations. Excuse me. The first is this famous, English, they call it the matchmaking corner, Changjiao, which is in People's Park. There are similar parks in almost every large city in China, where parents come on the weekends to find a spouse for their child. In fact, what they're doing is trying to find a family that's like theirs, and it's a process of matching families. I'm not going to go into detail, we can pick it up. This focus on the wedding turned out to be a terrific way to get in at the grassroots. This is not a family that I interviewed. These are people in a promotional shot from a hotel, but they are very much like many of the weddings I went to, and the many tens of videos that I watched with my interview subjects, in which the young couple has a very elaborate performance. And so the first article I wrote on this was called Performing Happiness for Self and Others. The wedding was central to the parents. Young couples often really did not want a fancy wedding in a hotel. They wanted to take a long honeymoon, they wanted a destination wedding, but they couldn't do it because the wedding was so important for their parents. So that celebration was a celebration of the parental success. And this is a picture I think that captures very well the multiple trends and feelings that are running through families as they pass through this important transformation. Fathers becoming father-in-laws, mothers becoming mother-in-laws, as well as younger men and women becoming a husband and wife. The third picture, this is mentioned in the article, but there's no picture, is this somewhat new ceremony for urban people. It is not a new ceremony for rural people. Many rural families continued a version of this, where the wife, the young bride, when she reaches her husband's family, kneels before the parents give a hongbao, and she is welcomed into the household. But what we have now with this Gaiko Fei is a new tradition for urban families. And again, this picture is from an advertisement from a video company, which specializes in videos for weddings. Again, I witnessed many such ceremonies, attending them. And I also was part of the standard interview. I asked all my interviewees, and I interviewed in that 2017, 100 men and women from 3 generations. So I was interested in the marriages of the parents in the late 70s and 80s, the marriages of siblings in the 90s, and the marriages of my younger generation. So you can see that in the article and in these pictures, the way in which a sociologist tries to get into the reality of what a marriage means in urban China. And then from reading the article, the other things, you know that what a sociologist is doing is by closely looking at this one ritual, this one ceremony, probing to see what are the dynamics of these families. How does it vary by class? Something that Professor Xiao will talk about also. How does it vary by region? Even when we're looking at urban, we look across different kinds of cities, northern cities, southern cities, et cetera. One of the findings when I did all the work on the advertising was that the wedding, the package wedding in the hotels is remarkably similar across all of China. And it's even seeping down so that those who marry in the village may have something quite similar in a county town. So there's a homogenization, even as the society as a whole becomes more unequal economically, and certain class difference is powerful. The next slide is from a advertisement in the Shanghai subways. And again, I took it off of the web. And this is the normative ideal at the moment. What's an ideal urban family look like? It's the parents with the son or the daughter, but I think in this case, the way the man is holding the older woman's shoulder, the ideal is a couple in their 60s, a son in the early mid 30s, with his wife, and now 2 children, a boy and a girl. So this is what we call the normative ideal. What I want to do in my remaining time is to talk about the future, the reality of what family life might be like, but also the norms. What is it that young people and their parents want for a family relationship? And here I'm going to bring in Yunxiang's book to which both of us contributed. And I want to say something a little bit about Yunxiang. This is a picture was taken 2 years ago in Beijing. He was born in Beijing. He has his PhD from Harvard. He now teaches, he's a professor at UCLA. And he was one of the very first people, based on 10 years of fieldwork in Heilongjiang village, to show that what happened under collectivization was an empowerment of young women and an empowerment of the couple. The young couple had access to certain private space and also private resources, even if the economy was collectivized. And then he proceeds to follow that through. The first book was called Flow of Gifts. The next one was called Private Life Under Socialism. And then he's written most recently a lot about individuation. So Chinese Families Upside Down, his last edited volume, means that today, particularly in urban China, the flow of aid goes from the upper generation to the lower generation, in particular toward the grandchildren. So that in these families of 4 grandparents, 2 couple, the husband and wife, and any number of, whether it's 2 children or 3 children, the flow is downward, and everyone is in some ways living and planning their lives through the children. And for him, this is families upside down. And the normative argument would be that this is also the emerging norm of what makes a happy family. He and I don't entirely agree, in part because in my work, because of the marriage focus in my research recently, I'm very focused on young men and women and middle-aged men and women and the kind of horizontal, intimate, and sexual ties that they have, which create tension with this more vertical downward movement. And that's the future, and it's the present, but it's also the future. This question of how the vertical loyalties, which flow from grandparent to the grandchild, intersect with these competing horizontal loyalties of husbands and wives. Now, very quickly, 5 minutes, I'm going to just give you some material, some of which may be very familiar with, some of it will not be. And that is, as a sociologist, I almost always go first to population data and concerns that of change at the population level or demographic trends. So I'm going to just flag for you 6 that I feel are really important for both explaining the changes in the last 10 years, but also where I think we might be looking in the near future. So the first is, again, well known to you, birth rates and death rates, birth numbers and death numbers. And we go all the way back to 1950. The period we're most interested in is since 1980, since the one-child policy. And what you can see in this graph, of course, is that by 2015, the rates are rather similar. What's perhaps even more dramatic are looking at the numbers. This is the number of births in China, and we can see since 2016, there's been this dramatic decline in the number of births. So that in 2021, last year, we estimate, the Chinese government estimates that it's 10.6 million babies were born. What is really important is that in the previous year, 10.6 million deaths were registered. So China has reached extremely rapidly a situation in which the number of deaths is equal to the number of births. This is very rare. Certainly, it's nowhere near like this in the United States or in any country in North America or Africa or the Mideast. There are few places in Europe which have reached this level. And Japan is the other place we look at for this rapid aging. But what I'm focusing on today is this intergenerational dynamic. So that the reason this ratio of births to deaths is so important going forward is this question of dependency ratios. And that is quite simply defined here by age, the degree to which those over 65, we think of the elderly dependents, what is the ratio of that age group to the blue and the green, those who are 20 and under? Or it can even be often the blue, meaning the young, very young who require a lot of care, and those 65 and older who may also require a lot of care. And what we can see is China is moving to a situation in which the dependency ratio is radically changing. So in this next quick slide, which is what we use for the the lecture I gave on in the fall for Schwartzman, is that we see a crossover point in about 2013, where if we look at the dependency ratio, it is no longer children, but it's elders. So if we think about the upside down family, this issue of, the ratio of the elders to children in families in the future is going to be different than it was in the past. It also has implications for the society. The next thing, 3 slides all relate. These are trends 4 and 5, the divorce and marriage. So you've read that in the article, but I just want to flag it for you. The blue shows quite high numbers. These are numbers, not rates, of people marrying across the whole country. The orange line on the bottom shows, especially after 2003, when it was no longer necessary to get the permission of your employer to register for a divorce, the dramatic rise in the number of divorces. And most recently, paralleling the drop in births, although it has a different determinant, is this dramatic drop in the number of marriages. Now, when marriages drop, we don't know whether people are just delaying. And in the past, that's generally what we thought was happening in the United States, in China. But there's something else I want to say before I talk about younger people and delaying marriage, and that's about remarriage. Because when you see numbers like this, declining numbers of marrying, high numbers, ever higher, increasing numbers of divorces, and in 2020, it continued in that direction, you can see that a very high percentage, or not percentage, the ratio of people who are remarrying for the second time is also very high. And this is Shanghai, which is where we can really track it quite. You can do it nationally, but I'm focusing on the city data. You can see that actually people are not giving up on marriage. They may be giving up on the partner, but they're not giving up on marriage. And here is data that I took from the census. I don't yet have access to the 2020 census. Of course, I'm interested. And this looks at people who have never married, men and women. And it's the blue line, and the peak is the men, and the low number is the women. And this is extremely high. And so this is 25 to 29. In the past, we would have think they were possibly not delaying. We now know that people in China, in urban China, are delaying, both men and women, to their late 20s to commit to marriage. They are cohabiting. They are sexually active in their early 20s and mid 20s. They may have more than several. They are not only sexually active with a person they'll marry. So there's been a sexual revolution, and that impacts the institution of marriage. And this is just illustrations to show how I'm keeping track. In the Q&A, we can talk more about why it's important, or what you in the audience think I may have missed. So the last slide is about this urbanization issue, migration out of villages. You can see in this slide, which I did for the lecture, which I went to the World Bank for, China has one of the fastest rates of people moving from the countryside to the city. And in fact, the percentage is much higher than this orange line would indicate, because, as we know, a very significant percentage, maybe 20%, are not changing their hukou. So when they say 50% is living in urban areas right now, it's closer to 65%. And if we're looking at young adults, unmarried young adults, or recently married young adults, it's probably somewhere between 70 and 75%. So when I talk about the dynamic of urban family life, in the past, we segregated it. There were the urban people who worked in Danwei, had urban hukou, had urban jobs, blue collar and white collar, and their lives were very different than those in the villages. This is no longer true. It's not true that life in the village isn't different than life in the city. It is, but the people are moving. So young adults and the families that are being built in China now are built in the context of one of the largest peacetime migrations ever seen in human history. So that, for example, in the last 5 years, 40% of all children are living with one or no parent during the school year. So we've got urban kids, we've got rural kids, but the largest single group are kids who are in these migrating families. So if we're talking about Chinese families going forward, we need to be really sensitive to the centrality of this outward migration from the village. Okay, this is the last slide. I've returned to the overview, and it asks about predictions, what comes next. And I think we're going to save that for the discussion. But the simple answer is, of course, we don't know. What we do know, as I said, is that people are marrying later. There is a small number of people who are deciding they don't want to marry, very small. There's a growing group, again, a minority, and higher among women who don't want to be parents. They want to marry, but they don't want children. And this is very important for understanding the future. The older generation and the values may not perfectly align, but the reality right now in urban China is that it is almost impossible for young adults to build a household and raise their children without intense engagement by their parents. So that on one hand, there are these demographic drivers, value drivers, making young adults want to have a different life than their parents, wanting to live separately and have greater autonomy. And then there's the reality that they can't survive unless the two generations, the word that Yunxiang used, are entangled. And I'll now move onward to hand it over to Professor Xiao, who is expert in this particular area.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Suowei, please, we look forward to hearing your presentation as well.
All right, I'll share the screen. I'm Suowei from Beijing Normal University, and thanks for everyone for showing up at early Saturday morning or late Friday night. Thanks for Deborah for sharing this macro background for the changing intergenerational dynamics in contemporary China. So my presentation will be focused on kind of more case study. It's kind of we look into the family to understand what's going on there by looking at this intergenerational collaboration in raising the child. So this is actually not a new thing for grandparents to be, for grandparents to be involved, in their adult children's family affairs, particularly help them to raise a child. So that's a kind of a long-lasting tradition. But statistics show that more than half of the couples, mostly the urban couples, have received help in childcare from their parents. It seems that this long-lasting tradition sustains, but there's a change in meanings. Scholars found that there are a lot of conflicts between parents and grandparents regarding parenting styles, how to raise the third generation. And there's also competition between them for building this intimate bonds with the third generation. And also, there's a kind of new phenomenon that grandparents become nannies rather than someone who actually simply enjoying playing with, having fun with the grandchildren. That's like kind of the conventional image that will emerge when we're thinking about the kind of the grandparents involved in this, the grandparents taking care of children. It's kind of fun for them, but now they become nannies. They do a lot of household chores, but while have little voices in the decision-making concerning the child development. So I think this is becoming a very key site to understand the changing intergenerational dynamic there. So in my research, I was asking very simple questions to understand what's going on there. First, I was trying to understand what's the division of labor in child rearing between parents and grandparents in contemporary Chinese urban families. And also, does this reveal a new pattern of power dynamics between them? If so, what are the characteristics or features of this new power dynamic, family dynamic? So to do this, I conducted qualitative research, which includes in-depth interviews with parents from 13 families and 8 grandparents. They all live in Beijing, and the grandparents and the parents, they live under the same roof at the time of the interview. And most of the participants in my study are middle-class families. The fathers hold managerial or professional jobs, and the mothers most are clerical or like academic jobs. And they have children between 3 to 10. Most of them are preschool age children. So that's the period that the young couples need help most from their from the grandparents. And I also did observation with 7 families. I visit their homes, participate in family gatherings, go on shopping with them, try to observe and better understand the interactions between the generations. And before I get into the details from my findings, I'll talk a little bit about what I perceive the changing practices of child rearing in contemporary China. What I would argue that like raising a child becomes a very complicated and labor and money intensive, like a very expensive and labor intensive family project. There's a few reasons for this. There's an emergence of like so-called scientific parenting that's kind of expert oriented. So you have to learn from experts rather than rely on your previous or past experiences. And it's also child-centered. That means the parents should develop child's talents and try to build good characters and try to cultivate their multiple talents rather than exam-oriented or exam-driven. So it's kind of the roles of parents have been extended, and they are not good parents are not only caretakers of the children, but they also have to be learners of this expert knowledge of scientific parenting. Also, they have to be consumers of this emerging markets for childcare and education. So they have to choose the best schools for their children, the best talented cultivating programs, toys, food, clothes, just to make it possible for the children to grow appropriately. So it becomes very expensive. For example, like in the families I interviewed, the expenses the families spend on the children on their preschools or school and the kind of cultivating programs usually exceed the income of the mother. So it's extremely expensive and it's labor intensive. So the tasks have been divided into different parts. The manual job, the mental job that is to make plans for the child development, to learn the most updated information concerning child development, and to educate the child, and the manual labor that is like to take physical care of the child, and also the auxiliary job that is to do in household chores. So that's been divided between different family members. So I think some of readers probably have seen these cartoons, these pictures or like jokes online. And there's an interesting thing that like captures the kind of the division of labor inside the family, which is in Chinese is 妈妈生，姥姥养，爸爸回家就上网，爷爷奶奶来观赏。The mothers gave birth and grandparents, the maternal grandparents raise a kid, and the father actually were mostly absent, but when he comes home, he's basically surfing online, and grandparents, they occasionally visit to see the child. So that's the kind of the joke there. It captures partial truths of what's going on in the family, but what I found is more complicated than that. So I found a pattern, what I call grandparents take care and mothers take charge in Chinese, 严母慈祖, that's adaptation from the traditional like 严父慈母, like the mothers actually giving nurturant care and fathers actually providing discipline and education to the child in traditional Chinese societies. So I perceive this as an intergenerational division of labor inside of the family. That is, mothers become this manager of this child rearing project. As I said, like child rearing have become a very complicated family project there. So what mothers do is that they actually make plans for the children. So they have to make decisions for the child development, from choosing educational institutions to arrange daily activities, including choosing preschool, early child education programs, leisure activities, making arrangements for weekend and holidays, shopping for food, clothes, toys that are age and gender appropriate. And to make good decisions, they also have to learn a lot from experts, from online, from surfing online, reading books, talking to other mothers, consulting experts, things like that. And they also engage in kind of cultivate intellectual and moral development of the children. So they usually read to the child, assess the child's talents, and developing relationships with preschools and training centers. Then they also kind of involve themselves into this character building of the child. They emphasize on self-discipline, emotional management, and the communications skills and good habits in the children. So that means but most of a lot of these activities were not only something they do to the child, it's also immersed in the daily care of these children. So they not only do this by themselves, they also have to supervise how others do this. And they are, in addition to this, they also take a partial daily care of the children. For the grandparents, they become the primary nurturant caregiver. That used to be the mother's role in traditional Chinese societies. So they take daily physical care of the children. They cook for the children, feed them, take them to schools and bring them back. Sometimes they give bath to the children and they kind of put on clothes, things like that. They also do the lion's share of household chores, cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, things like that. For fathers, they are mostly absent from the daily life of the children because they are super busy. They have to work overtime. And when they come back home, it's usually the children already in bed. And when they get up in the morning, the children were already sent to school. But their primary role is to be the provider for this very expensive family project to raise a child. They earn a lot to support this, and that excuses for their absence from the daily life of the children. And they perform another role as a playmate, that usually there's a quality time reserved for them, for the family, including the father over the weekend or on the holidays. And the fathers play with kids like on vacations or at home. And then they build a kind of a relationship like a friend with the children, rather than this very authoritarian paternal figure. So I would also argue this pattern of grandparents take care and mothers take charge is not only a division of labor, it is a kind of a new pattern of power relations within the family. So the mother stands at the center of the power. She's a primary decision maker, and she's also the supervisor of others who's taking care of the child. And for the grandparents, they are marginalized helpers in the family. So they do a lot of work, but they have very little voice in the decision-making regarding the child's development. So when the parents decide which school to send the kids to, which cultivation program to enroll their child in, the child in, they will not solicit opinion or consult the grandparents in general. But the grandparents have some autonomy in handling the household chores that they take care of. For the fathers, he's no longer this kind of the authority in the family and the primary decision maker for family affairs. In concerning the decisions for child development, now he is a participant in the decision making, and usually the mothers will consult them regarding the important decisions, for example, which preschools to send the kids to, things like that. But their opinion only matters when mothers buy into them. So why there's emergence of this new pattern of power relations in the family that puts the mother at the center, the young mother at the center of the decision regarding child development issues? So I think there I tried to provide 3 reasons for this. First, as we just mentioned, there's a changing discourse on parenting. With the emergence of scientific notions of parenting and the education practices, all the activities arranged for children have been changed. So the grandparents' previous experiences of grandparents for raising the kids have been outdated. So they were not familiar with what's going on at the current period. And that's why their experience become devalued at the operational level. But at the same time, this notions of scientific parenting and that's being promoted by the education industry also devalued the grandparents' experiences at a symbolic value. They usually set the grandparents at the bad example. So they will usually say, oh, this is the right way to do, not like what the grandparents did. So they devalue the grandparents' experiences at the symbolic level. And there's also intergenerational social mobility in the families I studied. So most of my participants, like the younger generation, the young middle class parents, they have achieved upward mobility through education. So they were usually the first generation of college graduates in the family. And they earn more than their parents. They have better education and higher socioeconomic status compared to their parents. So they were regarded as more knowledgeable and capable for making decisions for their own children. And also there is a transformation in the family structure. So when we were thinking about 3 generations living under the same roof, in traditional Chinese society, it's usually the house of the grandparents, right? So the grandparents is the master of the house. But in this newly formed intergenerational family for collaborating in child rearing, it's an extension of the nuclear family. That is, like most of the grandparents actually leave their homes to move into their adult children's households to better take care of the grandchildren. So it's kind of the young couple are the masters of this nuclear family, and the grandparents are become the guests and helpers in this family. So this changing family structure in these collaborations, in this intergenerational collaborations, also matters for why the young mothers becomes the center of the power, while the grandparents remain like marginalized in this setting. But why? Why do grandparents want to do this? So what are their perspectives? What do they expect from this relationship, from this collaboration and from these relationships? So why do they help? So in my interviews with these grandparents, normally they seek to maintain mutual assistance and with their children, their adult children, and they also want to build this emotional bonds with their children as well as with the grandchildren. Practically, they understand that the payback from the adult children is delayed, and it depends on the ongoing positive interactions between them. So they want to maintain this. And also emotionally, they give a high value on this emotional bonds with their children and grandchildren. They all say, oh, I enjoy doing this. I enjoy taking care of my grandchildren. It gives me a very important meaning of living. So with this in mind, they actually, when they have conflicts or when they have disputes with the mothers, they will be more tolerant. In order to maintain this good harmonious relationship in the family, they relinquish their power contestation, or they concede in struggles, they concede in family disputes for the purpose of maintaining this intergenerational intimacy and support. So it's not that they actually accept the authority of the young mother, it's that they understand as their tolerance and understanding for the young generation. But what do they expect? While they being kind of tolerant and understanding, they also expect the same thing from their adult children. So they expect for mutual respect and care from their children. And as well, I think there's one quote that's very revealing. As one grandparents said, we old people do not want money from them. We want kind words. For instance, when they return home, they will say, oh, Mom, you're still up. What did you eat today? As simple as that. So she wants to receive care from the children, and she wants the children to be mutually tolerant to them, not picking on them. But there's a challenge there, as I just said. The young mothers become the supervisor of the child care activities. Sometimes she will intervene when she sees other family members do not take care of the child in a proper way. So she will intervene, she will try to she will try to teach how grandparents do this. Sometimes it's kind of a challenge to the grandparents' face and dignity, a sense, and it's a challenge to this intergenerational bonds building upon mutual respect and care. So how do mothers cope with it? And there are different ways for mothers to cope with it, particularly in terms of different parenting styles and different lifestyles. So for some mothers, they actually strategized to build a close tie with grandparents to fulfill their intergenerational expectations. So they will show care, they will very tentatively show care to the grandparents, like buying their favorite food, shopping for their clothes, and taking them on vacations. And they also do things that matters to the grandparents, such as helping the relatives, and that helps to help the grandparents to gain faith and status among the relatives. That's very important to the grandparents. They're also yielding partially to the grandparents in manner affairs, daily affairs. They let the grandchildren to pick clothes for the children and cook for the children. They do not intervene in these minor affairs, but they will take charge in this major affairs, such as when they discipline the child. They do not want to the grandparents to get in and to protect the child from the disciplining. So they also adopted some sort of ritualized apologize when they have disputes, when they have arguments, and the mother would not she will steer to her stance, but she will apologize to the grandparents later on for her inappropriateness, the way she speaks to the grandparents. And they will sometimes arrange family meetings to inform the grandparents the decisions they made for the child, and also they let the grandparents to speak out what they think, their opinions on child for the grandchildren, even though the grandparents' opinions will not be taken into consideration in the final, would not weigh that much in the final decision, but it's give a chance for the grandparents to share their opinions. So in these cases, these mothers actually maintain the status of the power center in child rearing. She's able to discipline the child, to give some sort of advices to the grandparents when she sees it's inappropriate for them to do this. But in other cases, particularly in the cases between mothers and in-laws, it's not easy to build intimate bonds, particularly in the beginning of the co-residence. due to different parenting styles and lifestyles, there's open conflicts going on. To avoid these open conflicts, some mothers maintains a polite but distant relationship with the grandparents. So they functionally collaborative, and they basically they work on their own, they keep a very clear boundary on the things they did, and they collaborate with each other, but they are emotionally detached. The mother does not show much care for the grandparents. And in this way, in these cases, and the grandparents, they usually mute themselves in affairs that they're not involved. They do not share their opinions on where the children go on the weekend, on the family vacation, but they take total control over the things that they handle. So what they cook, how they do the household chores, how they treat the child. And they also tighten bonds with the grandchildren. So that is usually the case, that when the mother tried to discipline the kid and the kid cry out for help, the grandparent will intervene to protect the child. And also it's the case that the children make demands on grandparents that the mother doesn't seem as appropriate, and try to stop, but the grandparents will ignore the mother's opinion and just try just to satisfy the demand and satisfy the needs of the child. So in this way, they build this very close ties with the grandchildren by protecting and satisfying their needs. This is a way they try to achieve their status and emotional emotional fulfillment in the family. So I would perceive this kind of intergenerational power, new pattern of intergenerational power relations as uninstitutionalized hierarchy, even though the mother is kind of put in the center of the power relation, but it's not institutionalized like the traditional patriarchal family. So it leaves room for negotiation over power between family members, and it is manifested as the operation of intimate power, which means the formation of intimate relations provides basis for the function of power in the family. An individual's exercise of power is conditioned, mediated by intergenerational intimacy. And in a lot of cases, these intergenerational intimacies serve as a buffer in this power contestation in the family. So I'll come to a very short conclusion. So I think what I've presented concerning the intergenerational collaboration in child rearing provides a very revealing case for the concepts and theories that Professor Yan has coined in this added volume, that is inverted family and the post-patriarchal intergenerational reality. So there are a few features for this, include the significance of intergenerational solidarity sustains. We see that the grandparents and the parents, they rely on each other for practical and emotional meanings. And there's change there. So intergenerational interactions have become contingent more on individual agencies, negotiations, then on established rules, like in previous Chinese patriarchal families. And there's a transformation or even inversion of generational hierarchy. In the previous era, it's usually the senior generation have more power and have more power in the family. But now we have seen that the younger generation seem to obtain more power and authority in its family. And the meaning of the family, and as Yale has argued, the third generation has become the locus or the focus of the meaning of the whole family. And there's also an intimate turn in this intergenerational relations. As I just said, intimacy serves the basis for the power struggle how power function there, and also also becomes a buffer in this power contestation. So, okay, I'll stop here. I think I've already taken more than enough time. So yeah, so I'll stop here, and I'm expecting for questions and in the Q&A and discussions with Professor Davis.
Wonderful. Thank you to both of you for your fascinating talks and observations. May I invite the two of you to have a brief exchange with one another about each other's work before we head to Q&A.
Sure. I think I'll just briefly comment. Professor Xiao and I have already talked a little bit, just catching up. I think what she's observed fits with what many people have observed, not with her care, about highly educated families in the capital city. As I said on my comment at the end, I think since most children are in migrant households, the actual future as we're going forward would be very different. And I think my question to Professor Xiao, I was wondering if she would like to say something about not only class difference among families, because she has done a lot of work, not only this study, but I'm also interested in variation by the age of the children. In my presentation, I focused on young adults at the point at which they're marrying and how their parents are involved. And so I think that most of the examples that Professor Xiao just used now involve preschool children. And even though I know that there's some school age ones in the sample. So my question, I'd like her to say something more about possible difference by class, economic class, and also possible variation by the age of the child.
So my understanding of your question is that you want to say if the grandparental involvement in the collaboration in the child rearing project varies by the age, varied by the age of the grandchildren.
And by the class of the family, right?
The class of the family. I think, yeah, to some class definitely matters, because I think in the samples, in families I study, if there's one case that the grandparents have a higher status, like they are actually, like the grandpa is actually a retired general, like somewhere, but the thing is that they leave their hometowns in Jiangsu province to take care of the grandchildren in Beijing. So the grandparents actually have a very high status, and they have very high economic, they have a very high economic status and social status. So they retain more power in the family vis-a-vis the mother, compared to other families like the younger generation actually achieve higher upward social intergenerational mobility compared to their grandparents. I think that definitely, like the comparative social class backgrounds of the grandparents and the parents matters in this power contestation in the family concerning the intergenerational collaboration in child rearing. And for the age, I think that's interesting thing. Like in the most cases, the grandparents will leave when the children are old enough. So a lot of times when the grandchildren are old enough to attend school, the grandparents will leave their child's family, the adult children's family, and back to their hometown. So they will not they will get less involved. They will get less involved in these affairs. So I would say, so that's why a lot of sociologists in China calls this is a very temporary kind of formation of this extended family. Yeah, that's my sort of quick answer to your question. Yeah, I was actually very interested in Professor Davis' presentation regarding parental influence involvement in the marriage of young daughters and sons in urban China. And actually, I have seen that the parents have multiple ways to intervene in the children's marriage, in children's marriage. And one thing is that they actually actively try to find spouses for their for their children, as you've observed at matchmaking corners in Shanghai and elsewhere in China. And I think there are other ways for the parents to intervene in their children's marriage and have an impact on who the children will marry to, how they will get married. Would you please share with us some of your other observations regarding
Sure.
other
Sure.
ways that they get involved?
In the citation that went with the Marriage Corner picture, we have a survey of a random sample of all people born after 1980 and between 1980 and 1989, currently living in Shanghai. 40% are migrants. And there are many pieces of that survey. The part that I analyzed and wrote up with Tianfeng was looking at marriage, how people met their spouses. Approximately half meet their spouse on their own of that group. And then another 20% have an introduction from a friend, and the others have an introduction of parents and close kin. So even among this group who are not left over, these people are the ones who married on time, we found 25% met their spouse through the introduction of their parents. And this is higher than what surveys showed in Chengdu in the 1950s. And we weren't completely surprised since we've been following this issue, but this gave us a quantitative number. And now as we extend the survey, which is supposed to happen, obviously it didn't happen this year, but it should be next year, we'll be able to capture them up to the age of 35. And then we expect to have reliance on parents to be even stronger, because it's those who don't find a spouse on their own by age 30 who become more open to their parents making introductions. As you said, there are many ways in which parents steer people. So we found in our survey, and everybody else who's written on this, very few people in China in the last 5 years or even further will marry someone their parents oppose, so that the parents have a vetting opportunity. Those who go to the corner, that first picture, are very extreme. They are a minority. And what I've said at the end of the article, what I was very clear, we did surveys, we did all kinds of different ways of interviewing and observing, as well as the larger survey, is parents, as one man said to me when I was there in 2019, he said, they're not here to find a husband or a wife. They're there to find a family like theirs. So parents are trying to match on status. So 门当户对, let's have the gates match. This is the last thing I'll say, this is not unique to China. The idea that marriage is a way in which families match social class is pretty much universal. And the idea that marry women up when it's on education is true. That is, the preference is that a woman have less education or a lower ranked job, so she's, quote, marrying up. But in most cultures, and China's like that, the family background of households generally match, and it is normative. To marry far beyond your social class or below your social class is less desirable. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it's not the norm. So yes, parents play a big role. But what's striking, because we have surveys from the 50s, and then I did all this work in the early 80s, looking at family histories, 1,000 of them, people had more autonomy. Urban young adults had more autonomy before 1980 in finding their partners. That is, they autonomous of their parents. They still relied on introductions because dating was not very widely accepted. So what they would rely on would be the union head. and because I was working in factories and interviewing union heads, I also observed this, and I even was caught up in these various enterprises. So I think the striking counterfactual in many of these cases is that parents who are so deeply involved in their children's lives, playing this critical role in approving a spouse, themselves had more autonomy when they were young parents.
First up, Diana Slin, who's a counselor at Walton Counseling, who submitted one of the questions that we've collected prior to the event. And I'm going to unmute you, Diana, to ask the questions.
Carol, thank you, Professor Davis. Thank you, Professor Xiao. Actually, I attended Professor Davis' class when I was in Peking University, sociology major. Now I become a psychotherapist. I work with families, family therapists. So I really enjoyed your observations, and that really match what's happening in a therapy room. So my question is like this. According to a survey in Shenzhen from Shenzhen University, in a school with a sample of 1,300 junior school students, 17% suffer from serious depressive symptoms. So how do you think the changing family dynamic in urban China is affecting children's mental health, especially adolescents' mental health? Because from what I've heard from Professor Xiao, you talk about the power division, the power distribution in the family. So I think the parents, grandparents are sharing all the powers, and little room is left for this one child in the family. So how do you think it's affecting their mental health?
So Professor Xiao, you're going to take that?
Okay, yeah. So that's a very good question. Actually, I talked about grandparents and the parents. I didn't talk much about the children, and particularly what the impact on this, like this collaboration, this family project of raising child on the children. So one thing is that, like, when the grandparents and parents invest so much on the children, and they invest like money and labor in this raising this child. They have very high expectations for this child, and the child actually can sense it. The child actually can sense it, especially when they achieve like school age, and the mothers will actually. I think the kind of rise of this educational industry and those cultivating programs, the talent cultivating programs, are like other 补习班. So all this actually, they take up much of the child's time, and also put a lot of pressure on the children regarding he understands all the sacrifice the grandparents made and all the sacrifice the mother made. She sometimes sacrificed her own career development in order to nurture and to cultivate the perfect child, have put on this children. So I was thinking it has a huge impact on the children's psychological well-being by having too much attention on this kid, and by to recognizing and noticing too much sacrifice from the parental and grandparental generations. I think I do not have data on this, but from my observation, there's a big impact on this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you, Suowei. Next up, we have Bella, who's from a middle school in Beijing.
I want to ask Professor Xiao, like, what do you think the advantages and disadvantages are for the children nowadays when they are raised up and also educated in this kind of conflict? Because there are the like grandparents, and then there are also their parents, and maybe like their sisters and brothers impacting them.
Actually, I was wondering, can you share your opinion with us? Were you raised in such a family that you were like your mother's, like I described, that your mother make plans for you and your grandparents actually take care of you? is that true for you? Is that like the situation? Could you share what you think? Is that okay, Bella?
So like actually in my family, I have a younger brother and then also my grandma lives with me. So when I was small, actually like I stay with my grandma more, maybe probably than my parents, and they have different opinions on like education. So maybe grandparents they want the kid to uh, maybe have fun and play more, or they like when I wanted something, maybe my grandma will buy it for me for no reason maybe, and then maybe the parents' opinion maybe is to like educate the kid in a different way because um, the grandparents they have their opinions differently because they live like maybe they have a more experience, but it was the kind of education like in the 1970s and 80s back then. So when the community and the society is changing, so probably that's one of the factors that influence how parents and grandparents have different opinions on educating and raising up children.
Okay, thanks very much for sharing your experiences. I think it is true that you for the children grow up in such a family that what Professor Yan would call as 4-to-1 structure family, and the children actually receive a lot of resources. So especially for middle class urban children, I think they receive a lot of resources, material resources, educational resources, love, attention, things like that. They will not be neglected. That's the advantage these children receive in this kind of family environment. And I think a lot of times they did have a chance to cultivate their talents. But the disadvantage is that I would think the one thing is that we just mentioned that they have too much attention. It's also turn into a lot of pressure on them, and that might negatively affect their psychological being. And the other thing is that I'm not sure like what's your feelings towards your parents and your grandparents, but when observing the mother actually the marginalized positions of the grandparents, some of the children actually do not respect their grandparents that much from my observation. So they somehow seeing themselves as the center of the family, and also perceiving like they gradually adopt the views of the mothers and perceiving their grandparents as outdated, too traditional, and not much knowledgeable. So that somehow kind of contribute to this inverted generational hierarchies in the family. Yeah, that's something I think kind of failed the expectations on the grandparents, and that's a kind of disadvantage on this. Yeah, that's my response. Yeah.
Thank you, Bella and Suowei. Next up, and probably our final question is from Dylan, also a high school student from Shandong.
It is my honor to give this question. That in facing this kind of question, should we analyze it from the theory to practice in order from top to down, or should we summarize it from individual case?
So
I think the question.
Thank you, Dylan. Yeah, it's a great question. Deborah, please.
Right. So what you saw here was the sociologists who are empirically oriented. So we use multiple ways to understand. So I have national data, I have regional survey, sometimes literally 20,000 respondents. This one in Shanghai, 3,000 respondents. Then I spent a whole year visiting and doing face-to-face interviews. And Professor Xiao has also done that. So of course we have theories and hypotheses going into this. The one that's guiding today's is about the idea of the inverted family, the upside down family. And so Professor Xiao has shared tonight this very intensive study of the 13 families in Beijing. And I came at it at a more macro level and did not confirm the inverted family. I think that theoretically, as well as analytically, if we're talking about family relationships, we look at pairs of them, and we look at also the flow up and down. And so my main takeaway, the thing I'm talking about when I talk about the dynamic, is there is a very serious tension in Chinese families, as in families all over, between the horizontal loyalties between the couple at the core of a new family and their relationship with their parents, the generational one. And so that's what we're looking at. And I think the inverted family doesn't capture the multiple ways in which people in their family relationships are buffeted around. And that's why when I wrote the one essay, it's performing happiness. What one gets with the rituals, whether it's the Gai Ko Fei, whether it's the various aspects with marriage, or whether the ones other associated with family life, people perform as if they are happy. Because by going through it, you may feel happy. You also gain social position. But I think the question that Dr. Sun, the psychotherapist, raised is that there's a lot of unhappiness. And sometimes that can be caused by the failure to align public and private expectations of these family roles. So I think there's theory to play. I think theories about family are generally too broad because the target is not clear. So I think I should give the last time to Professor Xiao, who should. What do you think about theories and going from the top down or going from the bottom up?
Well, I totally agree with Professor Davis concerning the tensions in the family, and I think the conception of inverted family, inverted family, and the what Professor Yan has called the intergenerational, the relational ontology of the individual in China has to be re-examined in different cases, in different settings. And I think that what Professor Davis has presented and what I presented, like in the case of parental intervention, parental involvement in the children's marriage, and in the case of child caring in intergenerational collaboration in child caring, present like two different. Sometimes like I think there's a difference there, like in terms of family power structure. And in the case Professor Davis presented, it's like we see that the parents actually have more power in terms of authority, in terms of get intervened in the children's marriage. And in the case of my study, it's kind of the younger generation have more power over their parents. So how do we actually to interpret this divergence and to interpret the tensions that Professor Davis has just mentioned, the tension between this horizontal kind of loyalty, the collective loyalty, and the horizontal loyalty, the sexual intimacy based on sexual intimacy, the conjugal intimacy, and this kind of collective non-sexual loyalty towards along the generational lines. That's something I think should be further examined and analyzed in the future.
Fantastic. And thank you so much to Professor Davis and Professor Xiao for your really fascinating and wonderful presentations and responses and comments on our participants' questions. Thank you to our very attentive participants for both submitting questions prior to the event and also posing new ones at the event. Thank you to all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.